total darkness. Not twilight, not overcast. The absolute blackness of polar night on northern Svalbard, deep in January, 6 weeks before the sun will crest the horizon. A headlamp beam cuts across wind-scoured ice outside a small prefabricated research hut near Mushamna on the northern coast of Spitsbergen. The light catches something. A shadow shifts at the far edge of the beam, too large, too deliberate to be drift snow. There is a tripwire alarm ringing the station perimeter. It does not fire. Then, everything goes black. 6 weeks earlier, in late November, Dr. Erik Landgaard stepped off a snowmobile at the end of a 90-kilometer convoy from Ny-Ålesund and looked out at the place he would call home for the next 3 months. Mushamna Field Station sits at 78 degrees north on the coast of Spitsbergen, a cluster of prefabricated huts bolted to frozen ground at the edge of a fjord system that spends most of the year locked under ice. The nearest settlement is Ny-Ålesund, over 90 kilometers to the southwest. There is no road. There is no quick extraction. If something goes wrong at Mushamna in winter, help arrives when conditions and distance allow it to arrive. Landgaard was a marine mammal ecologist affiliated with the Norwegian Polar Institute. His assignment was a 3-month winter census of ringed seal breathing holes along the fjord. Painstaking work that required daily excursions onto the ice in conditions most researchers never encounter. He was not new to Svalbard. But before we get to what that rescue team found when they finally reached Mushamna, quick moment. If this kind of detailed breakdown is what you come to YouTube for, not the sensationalized version, but the actual forensics, the chain of decisions, the lessons buried in the data, then this channel is built for you. A like helps more people find these analyses, and subscribing means you won't miss the next case. That's all I'll ask. Now, back to that 40-minute standoff and the snowmobile team closing in from 26 kilometers south. He had completed 2 prior summer rotations at other stations in the archipelago, where polar bear encounters were managed with a well-rehearsed protocol. Flare guns, tripwire perimeter alarms strung around the station, and a strict rule against leaving structures alone during twilight hours. He had seen bears at distance, logged sightings, followed procedure. By any measure, he was competent. But competence earned in one season does not automatically transfer to another. Summer protocols on Svalbard are built on 2 assumptions. First, that ambient light, even the low, angled light of Arctic summer, gives personnel time to spot an approaching bear. Second, that polar bear movement is broadly predictable, tied to sea ice edges where seals haul out. Bears in summer are creatures of the coast and the flow edge, and their approach vectors are readable if you know what to look for. Winter on northern Svalbard inverts every one of those assumptions. During polar night, there is no ambient light. A bear could be 15 meters from the door and invisible. And the bears themselves behave differently. As the ice locks in and darkness settles over the archipelago, polar bears shift their hunting corridors inland, following the scent of cached food and human waste over distances that conventional summer protocol does not account for. They are not distant figures on ice floes. They are drawn to human outposts by smell, moving silently through total darkness, and the only thing standing between a researcher and 400 kilograms of apex predator is the perimeter alarm system, the tripwires that give you the seconds you need to react. The tripwire perimeter at Mushamna was rated for winds up to 50 knots. 4 wire anchors ringed the station at a radius of 30 meters, each connected to a pyrotechnic alarm designed to fire on contact and alert anyone inside that something large had crossed the line. 30 meters is not a generous buffer. A polar bear at full charge covers that distance in roughly 6 seconds. But 6 seconds is enough to reach a weapon, enough to fire a flare, enough to get behind a door. The system works if the system is intact. Repeated storms through December buried 2 of the 4 wire anchors under hard-packed drift snow. The anchors on the station's north side, the side facing the fjord, the side facing the direction bears were most likely to approach from, were packed under ice and snow so dense they could not trigger. The functional alarm radius on that side shrank from 30 meters to barely 12. 12 meters gives a person perhaps 2 seconds of warning. 2 seconds is not enough to do anything but flinch. Lundgaard knew. On December 29th, he logged the damage in his field journal, noted the buried anchors, and rated the repair as a next-day task. The wind chill that day sat below minus 35 Celsius. Bare hands on metal wire at that temperature means frostbite in minutes. The decision to wait was not irrational. He did not repair it the next day. He did not repair it the day after that. This is the lapse the entire case turns on. Deferred perimeter maintenance during the precise season when polar bears are most active around human structures. Each day the repair waited, the station's north side remained open. Each day, the dead zone between the buried tripwires and the hut door widened into a corridor where a bear could approach undetected, unannounced, and unchallenged. By the first week of January, that corridor had been open for 7 days. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the station, something had already found it. By January 4th, the tripwire gap on the north side of Mushamna had been open for 6 days. The polar night was absolute, and Lundgaard had developed another habit that compounded the first one. The Mauser 98 rifle issued to every Svalbard field researcher is not a suggestion. Norwegian regulations require any person operating outside a settlement in the archipelago to have a firearm accessible at all times. Not stored, not nearby, but on their person or within immediate reach. The rule exists because of exactly the kind of scenario Lundgaard was living inside without knowing it. In polar night, with no ambient light, with bears that approach silently from downwind, the rifle is not a hunting tool. It is the final barrier when every other deterrent has already failed. The flare pen buys seconds. The tripwire buys distance. The rifle buys survival. Lundgaard left it inside the hut. Station logs would later confirm he had done so on at least 4 prior occasions, stepping out for brief tasks with the Mauser propped against the wall by his bunk. The habit was born from summer rotations, from seasons where polar bears appeared as distant white shapes on a visible horizon, where sightings gave minutes of warning rather than seconds. Summer teaches you that the rifle is a precaution. Winter teaches you that it is the last layer. And Lundgaard was still operating on summer logic in the deepest dark of the Arctic year. At approximately 02:15 local time on January 4th, he unlatched the hut door and stepped into the wind. His objective was small and routine: a temperature data logger mounted on a post 18 meters from the north entrance. He carried a headlamp, a handheld VHF radio, and a flare pen holstered on his belt. 18 meters out and 18 meters back, a task measured in minutes. He did not know what had already arrived. A mature male polar bear, estimated later at over 400 kilograms, had approached the station from the northeast sometime in the preceding hours. It had crossed the dead zone on the north side, where the buried tripwire provided no alert, moving through the gap in the perimeter as though it did not exist. Because functionally, it did not. Tracks reconstructed afterward by the governor of Svalbard's search team told a patient story. The bear had circled the hut at least twice before settling into a position downwind of the north entrance. Downwind meant Lundgaard's scent carried to the bear. The bear's did not carry to him. It waited in the kind of darkness where a 400-kilogram animal can be invisible at 15 meters. When Langard stepped outside, the bear was fewer than 10 meters away. It closed the distance in under 3 seconds. There was no warning sound, no tripwire alarm, no shape resolving slowly in a headlamp beam. The bear seized Langard by his left shoulder and upper arm with a force that fractured bone, and it dragged him. 22 meters from the hut entrance, roughly the same distance he had intended to walk to reach the data logger. Except he was being pulled in the opposite direction, away from the only shelter within 100 kilometers, across ice-hardened ground, by an animal that outweighed him by a factor of 5. What Langard did next is what kept him alive. He managed to reach the flare pan on his belt and discharge it, not at the bear, but into the snow beside the animal. The burst of light and heat at close range startled the bear enough to release its grip. Momentarily. Langard did not try to stand fully. He crawled, then stumbled, orienting himself toward the hut by the glow of the headlamp he had somehow not lost. While moving, he keyed the VHF radio and broadcast a distress call on the frequency monitored by the Ny-Ålesund Operations Center, 90 kilometers to the southwest. The bear re-engaged before he reached the door. It came at him twice more during the retreat. Not the sustained mauling of a predatory attack driven to completion, but the repeated testing of an animal that had been startled but not deterred. Each engagement inflicted damage. Deep lacerations opened across his back. His right thigh was torn. He kept moving. The hut door was the only thing that mattered, and everything between him and it was measured in seconds and meters and blood on snow. He reached the door. He got inside. He barricaded it. And then the bear did not leave. For over 40 minutes, the animal remained outside the structure, clawing at the door frame and the external paneling. The sound of it, the scraping, the testing of joints and seams, filled the small hut where Langard lay bleeding, hypothermic, alone, and armed with nothing that could stop what was on the other side of the wall if the wall gave way. The prefabricated panels of a Svalbard field station are built to withstand weather. They are not engineered to withstand a focused polar bear. The rescue team was already moving. A secondary camp 26 kilometers to the south had received the relayed distress call and dispatched snowmobiles into the darkness. They arrived roughly 2 hours after the initial attack and drove the bear off with rifle-launched deterrent rounds. Langard was alive. He was evacuated by helicopter to Longyearbyen Hospital with significant soft tissue injuries, a fractured left scapula, and early-stage hypothermia. He would recover. But survival is not the end of the story. The investigation that followed would dismantle that night into its component failures: the perimeter, the rifle, the solo exit, and name precisely why each one alone was survivable, and why together they nearly weren't. The question was no longer what happened to Eric Langard at Mushamna. The question was what it meant for anyone who would ever work in polar bear territory again. Langard survived. He was airlifted to Longyearbyen Hospital with significant soft tissue injuries, a fractured left scapula, and early-stage hypothermia. The rescue team that reached Mushamna found blood frozen into the snow in a trail stretching 22 meters from the hut door, the distance the bear had dragged him before the flare bought those few critical seconds. Surgeons in Longyearbyen counted deep lacerations across his back and right thigh, damage consistent with repeated engagement by an animal capable of dismantling a ringed seal in minutes. He kept his arm. He kept his life. But the margin between survival and the alternative was measured in the time it took a single flare to burn against snow. Surviving an encounter like this does not close the case. It opens the investigation. The Sysselmannen, the governor of Svalbard's office, conducted a formal review of the January 4th incident at Mushamna. Their report identified what it called 3 compounding failures, and the phrasing was deliberate. Not 3 separate mistakes, 3 failures that compounded. The first, the unrepaired perimeter alarm. 2 of 4 tripwire anchors had been buried under hard-packed drift snow since late December. Langard logged the damage. He deferred the repair. The functional alarm radius on the station's north side, the side facing the fjord, the side facing the bear, had collapsed from 30 meters to barely 12. On the night of January 4th, it provided no warning at all. The second, the absence of the required firearm. Norwegian regulations mandate that any person outside a settlement in Svalbard carry a rifle accessible at all times. Langard left the Mauser 98 inside the hut. Station logs confirmed he had done so on at least 4 prior occasions. A habit carried forward from summer rotations, where bear sightings arrived with minutes of warning, and the rifle felt like excess weight for a short task. The third, a solo exit during peak polar bear activity hours without a spotter. 0215, deep polar night, no ambient light, no second pair of eyes. He stepped out alone into darkness that a polar bear is specifically evolved to hunt in. The investigation's central insight was not that these were reckless decisions. It was that each failure alone was survivable. A working perimeter with no rifle still gives warning. Time to retreat, time to radio, time to reach the weapon inside. A rifle with no perimeter still gives a last resort. The bear closes distance, but the human is armed. A solo exit with both systems intact still has layers of defense. The perimeter sounds, the rifle is present, the protocol stack holds. But remove all 3 simultaneously, and every layer is gone. The bear had a clear approach through the dead zone. It had an unaware target stepping into open ground. And it had an unarmed human whose only deterrent was a flare pen holstered on his belt. This is what the Arctic Protocol stack is designed to prevent. It is not redundancy for its own sake. It is not bureaucratic caution layered on top of common sense. Each element exists because the others can fail, and each compensates for a specific failure mode that polar night creates. Perimeter alarms compensate for the absence of light. They are the eyes you do not have when the sun has not risen in 6 weeks. Firearms compensate for the speed of a bear at close range. 400 kilograms covering 10 meters in under 3 seconds leaves no time for anything except a weapon already in hand. The buddy system compensates for the tunnel vision of solo work in extreme cold. A second person sees what the task-focused mind filters out. When all 3 are bypassed, the human is returned to a state of 0 defense against an animal that has been hunting in total darkness for 40,000 years. The case became a reference incident.
The revised 2024 Svalbard Field Safety Guidelines now mandate daily perimeter inspections regardless of weather conditions. No exceptions for wind chill, no deferral to the next shift. The guidelines also codify a buddy system rule for any exit during polar night. No one leaves a structure alone, for any duration, for any reason. And rifle carry compliance is now logged and auditable by station supervisors, removing the informal discretion that allowed Langard and others to treat the regulation as situational rather than absolute. But the detail that reframes the entire incident came from the search team's track analysis, not from the investigation's protocol review. The bear was never more than a few hundred meters from the station for the entire week prior to the attack. 7 days. The tracks showed a pattern of wide orbits that tightened gradually, circling the hut, testing the wind, registering the scent of food waste and human activity. It was not a chance encounter. The bear had been studying the station the way it studies a seal's breathing hole, patiently, in darkness, waiting for the moment the prey surfaces. And the collapsed perimeter meant Langard never knew. No alarm tripped, no tracks visible in the dark, no sound in wind that erases everything. For a full week, the distance between researcher and predator was measured in hundreds of meters, and the researcher lived and worked and slept in complete ignorance of that fact. Langard later told the review board that the most disorienting part of the entire experience was not the attack itself, not the jaws closing on his shoulder, not the drag across the ice, not the 40 minutes barricaded inside while claws scored the doorframe. It was the silence before it. No alarm, no sound. Just a shape materializing where nothing should have been. Outside the Mushamna station, the polar night continues as it always has. The wind moves across the ice shelf and presses against the prefabricated walls. The darkness is absolute. And somewhere in it, something is circling. Patient, silent, adapted to conditions that strip every human advantage down to nothing. In polar night, the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence.